Good afternoon. My name is Brad Jensen. I'm a professor at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, and on behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion today. We have just terrific panel assembled, if I do say so myself. But before I turn to our speakers' bios, I'd like to just give you a word about the Georgetown Center. The Georgetown Center, which is housed within the business school at Georgetown, is focused on bringing together the business community, the policy community, and the research community to talk about issues of interest at the nexus of business and public policy. With my colleague Bob Vastine, who is unfortunately not here today, we organized the Trade Georgetown on the Hill program, but there are other programs that the Georgetown Center organizes in regulation, innovation, and energy as well. So if you have interest in those topic domains, I would encourage you to check the center's website. I'm also told that we will be tweeting this, so if you want to tweet, there's #Georgetown on the Hill. So now to our panel to discuss where we're going to go with NAFTA and what the potential implications are. First panelist will be John Verano, who is to my right. He is a partner in the International Trade Practice Group of Covington and Burling. Prior to that, John served as Deputy United States Trade Representative, and very much looking forward to John's comments. To John's right is Christine Bliss. Christine is the president of the Coalition of Service Industries. Prior to joining CSI, Christine was the Assistant United States Trade Representative for Services. To Christine's right is Josh Nasser. Josh is the Legislative Director for the United Auto Workers. Prior to joining the UAW, Josh worked as the Assistant Legislative Director for the Service Employees International Union. And last but not least is David Thomas at the far end. David is Vice President for the Business Roundtable. Prior to joining the Business Roundtable, David served as Trade Counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee. So a very distinguished set of panelists. We will have some introductory comments by each of the panelists, and then we will open it up to the floor for question and answer. So, John, please lead us off. What's going on with NAFTA? What are the range of possible outcomes, and where are we going to end up?
Well, it could go in one direction or another. Next. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for coming. Interesting topic. Just to put NAFTA in the focus of our conversation here today in a little context. As you know, during the presidential campaign, the president made 4 pledges, quite explicit pledges with regard to trade. One was to renegotiate or withdraw the U.S. from NAFTA. Another was to label China a currency manipulator. The president chose not to take that step. A third one was to withdraw the U.S. from TPP, which, as you know, the president did do that. And then lastly, there was a more amorphous pledge to catalog unfair trade practices by our trading partners. And that is sort of is a little more amorphous how that is being handled right now. There are a number of studies underway. But with regard to NAFTA, I think it was inevitable that our trading partners would have agreed to renegotiate, or at least try to renegotiate NAFTA. NAFTA is, almost 25 years old. There have been a number of trade agreements negotiated, bilateral and regional trade agreements negotiated since then. So I think, in the trade community, certainly I think there would be a receptivity and support for updating NAFTA. I think the political challenge for the president in renegotiating NAFTA is how the problem of NAFTA was defined. So if you define the problem of NAFTA as it is creating trade deficits, it is encouraging U.S. companies to move production to Mexico. That was a major focus and a common way of characterizing it. But if you characterize the problem of NAFTA that way, then you have a bit of a challenge, I think, in coming up with a solution that addresses that problem, or the problem as described in that way. Because, you know, our trading partners are probably unlikely to agree to a new NAFTA that is more trade restrictive than the current NAFTA. So I think that is the big political challenge I think the President faces in coming up with a new NAFTA that our trading partners will agree to, that addresses the problem of NAFTA as defined in the campaign. That said, I think the President has incredible latitude as to what he does. As I mentioned, of the 4 campaign promises that he made, you know, he didn't follow through on China currency. That was a fairly commonly raised topic during the campaign, and nearest I can tell, there was no political repercussions, negative political repercussions from him not doing that. So the President continues to enjoy strong support from those who supported him, especially those who supported him in the primary process. So, you know, I hear a lot of talk about people saying, well, the President has to do something dramatic on NAFTA because he made such a major focus of it. And I frankly just don't buy that. I think the President has a certain Teflon coating that he can do something drastic, and we'll talk about that now, or he could not do anything. And I think I'm not convinced that it is politically damaging to him. But just to sort of catalog, as Brad asked me to do, sort of the options, just to lay them out there. By my math, there are 5 options. There's what I would call NAFTA 0.0, which is we just withdraw from NAFTA, and that's the end of it. It's a repeal and don't replace. There's NAFTA 1.0, which is obviously the status quo. There's NAFTA, what I call 1.5, which is NAFTA is amended by the parties as the agreement allows for, but it's not amended in such a way that either legally or politically it is necessary to come back to Congress, to this institution, to have it passed through the Congress in any way. So it's amendments, and there have been amendments to NAFTA, rules of origins, kind of small items, but you could imagine some larger amendments that don't involve changes to U.S. law, but could be significant, but the parties don't have to, the President doesn't have to come to Congress to present it. And then, of course, NAFTA 2.0, which is, I think, the assumption of where this train is heading, that would be a fairly fulsome renegotiation, updating of the agreement, and it would eventually come to Congress for a vote. And then, lastly, in my 5-star universe is NAFTA 3.0, which is more form than substance, but it is a trading in of NAFTA as one trilateral agreement into 3 bilateral agreements. And that is more form than substance, but it would seem to satisfy a goal, if it is a goal, that when the Jeopardy game is on TV in 20 years and someone says, who ended NAFTA, which president ended NAFTA, that would be President Donald J. Trump ended NAFTA. The fact that it was replaced with bilateral agreements may not be, in the scheme of things, terribly important to people who just want to get rid of NAFTA as it currently exists. I don't know myself what will happen. I've lost many bets predicting what will happen with this administration and events leading up to this administration. I would say this, there seems to be, there are a lot of smart people whose opinions I value, who think we are in a, if you look at what has been tabled, there is such a gap between what the U.S. is tabling and what anyone could expect our trading partners to accept, that we are clearly headed to a position so the President can say the negotiations are stymied, I'm left with no option but to withdraw. I don't subscribe to that. It's not that I don't see those similar markings on the wall, but I actually don't think NAFTA is going to be, I don't think the U.S. will withdraw from NAFTA without anything in its place. I can't tell you exactly why I'm so sure, or how the machinations that lead us to that, but I actually ultimately think that the institution of Congress is going to assert itself, if it comes to that, to, if not legally, at least politically, put a marker down that Congress has a constitutional, not an exclusive constitutional role, but a constitutional and critical role in trade agreements. And I find it difficult to imagine that Congress would just sit by and have an agreement, a major agreement, probably the most economically significant agreement of the U.S., withdrawn from, and Congress takes no action and just lets it happen. I know NAFTA is a political albatross in many districts and states, although the polling, frankly, is a lot more balanced than some of the rhetoric would suggest, as far as people who think NAFTA, on balance, is good for America. But I personally think that this institution, which is probably not anxious to vote on NAFTA one way or another, but I could imagine a scenario where the institution reflects its constitutional prerogatives to be part of any major decision to withdraw from a major trade agreement, given the role they play in putting those agreements in place. But when I leave it at that, I'm sure that's what we will end up talking a lot about who has what power and when can it be exercised and whether it will be exercised. But that's sort of the landscape as I see it.
Thanks, John. Christy?
Well, thanks very much to the Georgetown Center and the McDonough Center, and very pleased to be able to be here today on the panel with my former boss, John Verno, sitting next to me, and colleagues from the private sector. I represent the Coalition of Services Industries, which represents a broad spectrum of U.S. services industries, from information, communication, technology services, financial services, logistics, distribution, professional services, to media and entertainment. And increasingly, I think, as all of you are very aware, many, and if not most, of these services are digitally enabled. So a lot of the work that we do at CSI is informed by our effort to promote strong rules on digital trade, which are of common interest across services sectors, but more importantly, across the economy generally, whether it be manufacturing or agriculture or other sectors. Our starting point when we talk about NAFTA is the substantial benefits that have accrued to services and investment from the NAFTA framework across all of the sectors that I've mentioned. In terms of both rules and market access commitments, whether you look at cross-border services, the investment rules, guaranteeing non-discriminatory treatment, providing for binding dispute settlement, both state-to-state and investor-state dispute settlement, a financial services chapter, a telecom chapter, a temporary entry chapter, providing for entry for many services providers, not only in standard categories like business visitors or intercompany transferees, but more importantly in NAFTA, a long category, a set of professional service suppliers, which is really unique to NAFTA. a customs chapter, which has also been very important in promoting customs harmonization in the region, and a strong procurement chapter, which has enabled U.S. service suppliers, in particular in financial services and in the IT sector in particular, to get tremendous market access, particularly in the Mexican market. So the rules that were negotiated in NAFTA were really path-breaking at the time they were negotiated, and in fact, in many ways, more comprehensive than what was negotiated in the WTO and the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And so, as I say, that's our starting point, because I think it's important to remember the very, very important foundation for trade rules, particularly in the North American region, that was created by the NAFTA agreement. So what has this meant for services and investment? Well, it has meant a significant trade services surplus for the United States in both Canada and Mexico. And it currently supports, and this is probably on the low end of the scale, but at least around roughly 600,000 U.S. jobs and probably more. Because one of the things that we've increasingly learned is the degree to which services are embedded in or are part of exports of manufactured and agriculture commodities. So that when you look at U.S. exports in the goods sector, the agriculture sector, you're also looking at a significant portion of services exports. So that's why, as I say, that 600 rough number is probably on the low side if you really traced all the jobs that were being connected to exports with respect to Canada and Mexico. One of the areas that has been very, very important for services are the investment provisions, because they've provided commercial certainty and a level playing field for U.S. service suppliers in both Canada and Mexico. And one of the things that people, I think, are beginning to realize is the degree to which foreign direct investment is really critical to expand services markets around the globe. And that's because, for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, most services industries require proximity to their customers. And that means they need to establish a local presence in a particular foreign territory. The second aspect is that services sectors are frequently heavily regulated, which also leads to a requirement that they establish a local presence. But maybe even more important than these elements is recognizing that that foreign direct investment is not a zero-sum game for the United States. Because what that investment does is it draws U.S. exports and it also supports U.S. jobs here at home. I think it was the ITC, for example, that looked at the insurance sector just as one example, and I think, or other sectors, and I think they traced just in looking at a few, not all services sectors, that foreign direct investment supported in the hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs. So very, very important. The other part of the investment piece for services is the extent of inbound investment in the United States from Canada and Mexico, which is also supporting a very significant share of U.S. jobs. The other piece I want to mention in terms of real commercial interest and benefits to the United States and service suppliers are the procurement provisions, which have provided secure access for U.S. service suppliers, and as I mentioned, particularly in financial services and the IT sectors. And just to give you a flavor of what this has meant, 3 out of 4 Mexican government employees are insured by a U.S. firm. And that's a tremendous volume of business. A second U.S. firm is also supplying a significant share of auto insurance, just to give you an example, to the Mexican government. So this is an opportunity that exists on the national, local, and regional level in Mexico, and something that has been provided directly as a result of NAFTA. Customs and trade facilitation is another area where services industries have benefited tremendously. And then finally, overall, NAFTA has clearly helped to integrate the Canadian, Mexican, and U.S. markets in terms of supporting global value chains. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, research has shown that over 60% of global business services exports are indirect, meaning that they are actually things that are embedded in other goods or commodities that are exported abroad. Now, I think as John mentioned in his opening remarks, the opportunity is now that NAFTA is a couple of decades old, to modernize its provisions, to preserve what exists, but then build on top of that. And for CSI members and other industries, building new digital trade disciplines, building on what was done in TPP and what was tried to be done in the Trade and Services Agreement negotiations, taking pieces of that and putting them on the table in NAFTA is a critical part of the current modernization exercise. We also want to see a revised cross-border services chapter, which has even stronger provisions on express delivery. We want to see expanded investment provisions, particularly in the area of investor state, a stronger customs chapter with streamlined procedures and higher de minimis levels, and also disciplines on state-owned entities. Now, obviously, one of the things we're talking about today are a number of the proposals that have been introduced by the U.S. administration in the negotiations, which are troubling, some of which would directly affect services, some of which, while not directly affecting, we are nonetheless concerned about because we are concerned that they would go backwards in terms of rolling back the existing framework and would be harmful to those existing benefits. And I'll just flag those that seem to be of most direct effect on services. First is the proposal to have a 5-year sunset provision. We're extremely concerned about that, and our concern is not unique, I think, in the business community more broadly, and that is we think it would introduce a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and more importantly, we think it's unnecessary because NAFTA already has a trilateral commission and regular consultative provisions and an amendment process that can allow for any of the parties to bring up new issues and to actually amend the agreement, as John mentioned. So it seems to us that this notion of a 5-year review and a sunset provision is unnecessary and, more importantly, extremely disruptive in terms of commercial certainty. The second proposal that we're concerned would have a direct effect on services is the proposal to cap the amount of procurement access in the U.S. market and somehow tie it so that there'd be more of a one-to-one relationship between access in the Canadian and Mexican market and the U.S. market. As I said, the U.S. is a clear winner on the procurement market side as a result of NAFTA, and we think this new proposal would, again, lead to a rollback and potentially undermining of those existing benefits. And then finally, I would just highlight that we're also concerned about the opt-in, opt-out proposal with respect to investor state. Investor state is, in our minds, an important measure and provides commercial certainty for investments. But more importantly, looking back to the original purpose of investor state, the whole idea was to depoliticize investment disputes so that governments would not have to weigh various foreign relation and other aspects in weighing whether or not to bring a dispute against another country. So we think that that's a point that's being missed in the debate and one that we don't want to lose sight of. Secondly, we think that investor state promotes the rule of law, and that has been a value that the United States has promoted long in promoting investor state in its bilateral investment treaties and FTAs, and again, one that we think should continue to be an important value and one that's tried to be promoted. Last area I will quickly focus on and then turn to my colleagues for their remarks is we have begun, unfortunately, in terms of the scenarios that John laid out, to the possibility of a potential U.S. withdrawal or notice of withdrawal from NAFTA. And I just want to highlight in terms of general effects, we think there's no question that that could lead to a general disruption of existing supply chains, which would be unfortunate. And one of the things that we think could happen, which we might not immediately focus on, is to the extent that suppliers in that chain are located in different parts of the world or in different NAFTA countries, as you look for what can I now rely on if NAFTA is no longer there, there may be a mismatch between benefits that are entitled to those suppliers if they're from other countries. So we are very concerned about that potential effect. We also think that it would have the unintended consequence of giving a leg up not only to Canada and Mexico, since the agreement presumably would stay in effect with respect to them, but it would also give a leg up to U.S. competitors, whether it be Europe or others, that would have continuing FTAs with Mexico and Canada. Then last, I would just touch on some of the general parameters and what would happen in the event of a withdrawal. With respect to Canada, what the default would be the U.S.-Canada agreement. So that would be the first thing, I think, that the U.S. Suppliers would look to. The problem with that is the coverage, certainly of services and of procurement in particular, was not as complete as it was in NAFTA. So clearly there would be gaps and holes. And on investment, no investor state was included in the investment provisions in CAFTA, so that would be gone. The next default that you would look back to would be the GATS commitments, where in services, if you have a commercial presence, there might be the possibility of bringing a case under dispute settlement. But again, it would only depend to the extent that Canada had particular commitments in the services areas that you were most concerned about. With respect to Mexico, there would be no default because we don't have another bilateral agreement in effect. So what would we look to? We'd basically look to GATS commitments. And there, Mexico's commitments are not as complete in services or financial services as they are under NAFTA. Again, you would not have the investment protections. You would only have WTO dispute settlement, and again, only to the extent that Mexico had taken commitments on services. And then last, I think I've already focused on this in my preliminary remarks, but just to highlight that when service suppliers would look back to what are the defaults, whether it be the GATS or whether it be CUSTA with respect to Canada, there's also the immediate loss of substantial benefits under NAFTA that would be gone, whether it be procurement access or whether the market access commitments that I said in the beginning are clearly better and more comprehensive than what was negotiated by either Canada or Mexico in the WTO. So let me stop there and happy to be part of the broader discussion.
Thank you. And thanks for having me today, and thank you all for being here. So first of all, I just wanted to tell you that on behalf of the UAW's million members and retirees, we're really happy to engage in this discussion. And I want to make it clear that it's not really a question of, looking at NAFTA, other trade policies, of being for or against trade. Sometimes the debate is discussed that way. I'm not saying the prior speakers did, but it often is. And that's just kind of a false choice. We do live in a global economy. There is an awful lot of trade, and it's more how is the trade conducted? What policies do we have? And who benefits and who doesn't? And that's really the question here. Now, when it comes to NAFTA, UAW, we thought NAFTA was a poorly designed treaty in the first place. And the reason why is because it really puts investors and corporate America in the driver's seat instead of workers. And NAFTA has been a bad deal for workers, for manufacturing workers in general, in all three countries. I want to be clear about that. You can look at wages, for example, and again, this isn't just because of NAFTA, but if you just look at, for auto workers, union and non-union, between 2003 and 16, there's been nearly a quarter decline in real wages, in parts about 13%. And so what we have seen is the productivity, by the way, of U.S. workers, Mexican and Canadian workers is very high. It's not a factor of U.S. workers aren't productive. Productivity keeps increasing. Wages haven't kept up. And NAFTA is part of the problem. And so we welcome the opportunity to fix some of these problems. Fundamentally, there's a problem in Mexico with the fact that Mexican workers do not have real independent unions and are not able to freely collectively bargain, and their wages are extremely low. There was a recent article about a BMW plant that opened where many of the workers earn about $2 an hour. By the way, the contract, the workers never saw, because you have company unions that are closely tied to the government, which negotiated it, and workers never had a real choice. You know, obviously, the cars are very profitable, but the workers have not, reaped the rewards of those profits. So fundamentally, what we're talking about here is what can be done to make it so workers in all three countries benefit more from trade. That's what we're trying to get at here with NAFTA. And we look at it in the auto industry. What has happened is that there are tons and tons of auto manufacturers, parts suppliers that used to produce in the United States, moved to Mexico, and then shipped the exact same part back into the United States. That is the vast majority of parts built in Mexico are shipped back to the United States. So it's not a matter of these are parts that can't be made here. They were made here, and they are made here often. So actually all the time. So what are we trying to achieve here? What we're trying to achieve is higher wages and better living standards for workers in all three countries. In order to do that, we need to have a total new look at our labor chapters, because the reality is that the labor chapters in our existing trade agreements have been toothless. The enforcement mechanism is that, dispute settlement where, and it's against a country, by the way, not a company, one big problem, very hard to put a case forward, extremely long to try to resolve it. There's no track record of these labor chapters working. And so what we need is a total relook at labor chapters in a fundamental way. That's one thing. The second is that we really have to look at what can be done in a related way on to deal with our trade imbalance in autos and auto parts. And I would suggest that companies who mistreat their workers, who deny their basic rights, who drastically underpay them, should not have a competitive advantage because of that exploitation. It's a dumping of sorts. In some refer to it as social dumping. So that has to be addressed. So as far as this renegotiation, I don't know where it's going to conclude. I'd say we welcome the fact that there finally is a renegotiation, and we do think that there's some important issues that are on the table that should have been on the table an awful long time ago. And there's other reasons why NAFTA, hurts U.S. workers. It is commonplace for in contract negotiations and in organizing drives for companies to threaten to move to Mexico. It's often said explicitly. It's implied all the time. And the threat is basically, if you push too hard, if you want to have too good of health care or benefits or, wages to support your family on, we're going to close shop and go to Mexico. We hear that all the time. Workers hear that all the time. So you need to understand that the impacts of NAFTA you got to look beyond just the literal trade imbalance, which is enormous, which has ballooned. So the auto parts trade imbalance has increased about 200% since the start of NAFTA. 200 times, not percent. So what we're looking at here is a process that is long overdue. What's going to measure as whether it's successful or not is if the idea is if there are credible measures in the agreement that actually will lead to higher wages for workers in all three countries. That's to be determined. That's to be determined. I would say, I'm clearly going to not be aligned with the other speakers on many issues here. I'm used to that. That's fine. We could agree to disagree and be friendly here. But when it comes to investor-state dispute settlement, we have a fundamental disagreement. We think that the idea of there being these special courts that operate outside, the regular kind of legal realm and actually have the ability to put penalties on countries for their laws is just wrong-headed. We think that the mechanisms for ensuring fair trade should have to go through regular processes like everyone else. And so the idea of trying to rein in investor-state, I think that makes sense. We don't think that those are a function that help workers or help investment. Now, I want to just say that we're also talking about where the investment's happening. For the UAW and for workers in America, we want that manufacturing, we want that investment to happen here. And for many companies, I mean, the reality is that their response is their ultimate goal is not maximum U.S. employment, it's maximum returns. That's fine. That's how business operates. But let's not confuse the two. Just massive investments in other countries is not better than having massive investments in the United States. So I think when we're looking at this here, often there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of stark choices that are often presented. But what we really have to do is look at the details and measure it against this barometer. Is this going to help raise wages here? NAFTA's not the only downward pressure on wages here and on why more and more middle class families are leaving the middle class. Manufacturing jobs, many of them pay less than $12 an hour now. We're proud of the fact that we helped establish manufacturing jobs as middle class jobs through collective bargaining. But union density is dropping, and the campaigns against organizing have intensified greatly. It's commonplace. It's often that workers are threatened. If you exercise your rights, you're going to lose your job all the time. If you exercise your rights, we're moving to Mexico. So it's an enormous challenge here. I'm not going to say any of this is easy. I'm not going to say that, that there aren't any potential problems out there from any decision that's made. But really what we're looking at is, at the end of the day, has agreement been changed in a way which will improve the lives of workers in all three countries? And it has to be, if we don't do anything about the problems in Mexico and the fact there aren't real rights for workers in Mexico, then it's very hard to see how the situation is going to improve. So look forward to the conversation, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad and Bob, who's not here, and Georgetown for having me as well. It's good to be a part of this distinguished panel. I have, I guess, the advantage and the disadvantage of being the last speaker, which is that much of what I was going to say has been said, particularly by John and Christy. But I want to make just a couple of points, and mindful that I'm between my speaking and your questions, which I think we want to get to. So quickly, Business Roundtable, if you're not aware, an association of CEOs of large U.S. companies, most sectors of the economy. We have about 200 CEO members, collectively employ about 16 million American workers, and generate about $440 million each year in revenues for small and medium-sized companies. The first point I want to make is and I agree with Josh in terms of it's not whether we are for trade or against trade, or whether we're for NAFTA or against NAFTA. This is an opportunity, we hope, on NAFTA. I want to make a general economic point, too, to broaden that out. The president and others are pushing to get the country to 3% economic growth and to support more American jobs and more investment. And we have other policy initiatives like tax reform and regulatory reforms that our organization and others are very supportive of that will be big drivers of those efforts. On the other hand, it really is a three-legged stool with trade as well, in addition to tax and regulatory. And our concern is that if we're to see a termination or a threatened termination or a weakening of NAFTA, or course, I would add, to South Korea, free trade agreement, or other trade agreements, that would undermine the goal of getting to 3% growth and supporting more American jobs overall. Again, recognizing that no trade agreement is perfect and can be improved. And I think that's the point on NAFTA. Our organization really, this gets to my second point, feels there's a critical choice here for the administration, for Congress, for all of us as stakeholders, which is, and John sort of laid this out too, this could go one of two ways, as John put it. A choice to modernize and strengthen, or a choice to terminate or weaken. And when we look at this collectively, as what is the impact on U.S. growth and the investments that can lead to, and the jobs that can support, we are really pushing, working with the administration and Congress, to try to modernize this agreement. We sent a letter to the president back in May. It's on our website that lays out those priorities. Christy covered some of those. And we have an agreement that's over 20 years old. There have been legal trade investment reforms in all three countries that could be codified in this. Look at the reforms in Mexico on telecom and financial services and energy that create new opportunities for U.S. companies of all sizes. Christy talked about e-commerce, digital trade, cross-border data flows, stronger intellectual property rights protections, et cetera. We as an organization also see this, to Josh's point, as an opportunity to include stronger labor and environmental protections, and to include them within the agreement itself, which they are not today in NAFTA. And recognize that those labor and environmental standards have evolved and strengthened over the course of the years with our 14 existing free trade agreements. And we recognize that people have different views on what those standards should look like going forward as well. The third point I would make in terms of those proposals to hopefully modernize versus weaken, Christy covered several of those proposals that also concern our organization in terms of a sunset clause, potentially making ISDS optional, and then the potential cutting back of government procurement. I'd add one more, and this is not an exclusive list, but the proposed rules of origin, particularly generally, but also with respect to the auto sector, increasing that. Where in NAFTA you already have the highest regional rule of origin percentage out of any of our trade agreements. And then in this proposal from the administration to impose a U.S. content requirement on autos for the first time, reportedly at 50%. And the concern there for our members is both with respect to the North American marketplace. I think NAFTA has helped our three countries and companies in our three countries make things together to our mutual benefit, that we sell not only to one another, but to the rest of the world. And that was part of Christie's global value chain point. The next point I'd make is, there are many, NAFTA has helped build those types of mutual benefits. It's not a perfect agreement. It can be improved, and it should be. And again, our letter from May lays out our priorities for doing that. But it has had gains, and others talked about that. I have a handout outside, which is a national level sheet of our data on how NAFTA has helped increase trade and supported jobs with Canada and Mexico. We also have state-by-state sheets. So if you pull that sheet on the outside table, at the bottom of it, you'll see a link to our website. You can find any of the 50 states have a fact sheet as well on that. So I won't belabor those benefits. The flip side of that then is what's at risk or what's at stake with those benefits, and hopefully this opportunity to build on those benefits. I would make one other point. The others talked a lot about exports, particularly Christie, but on the import side too, and it relates to the supply chain point, we estimate that about 68% of imports in 2015 were inputs or components that U.S. manufacturers and U.S. farmers use to make products. And again, it's just one example. I mean, a lot of people think of imports as being the finished products that consumers buy. And there's certainly that too, but there's a lot of intermediary products that companies of all sizes rely on to enable them to produce their finished products and to do so competitively, to sell not just in this country, but other countries as well. I guess the last point I would make is one in terms of competitiveness and leadership by our country. And I think this is particularly relevant now with the president and his team in Asia visiting several countries. And we really do worry if NAFTA were to go away, or even if it was threatened of a termination or weakened, that really does create an opening for our competitors in Asia and Europe. And we've seen that, many examples of that, those in the Mexican community talking about how they could, already looking at where they could get ag exports from other parts of this hemisphere, for example, et cetera. And you look, Mexico has 11 free trade agreements with 45 countries today, not counting the United States. Mexico is negotiating with the remaining 10 TPP countries. Canada has 14 FTAs, or free trade agreements, with 43 countries. Again, not counting the U.S. It's got 7 under negotiation, including with the TPP. And the last point I would make, when you look at Asia, where the president is now, if you look at those 11 remaining countries in the TPP, which now excludes the U.S., those countries collectively are pursuing 27 trade agreements. And I make that point because a big driver of trade agreements is obviously to help us export more goods and services, but also higher standards, higher rules of the road. And rule of law is one example of that, to Christie's point. And they really are designed, our market in the U.S. is already tremendously open. And these trade agreements are important opportunities to further pry open foreign markets. Because that's where 95% of the world's population is, with, I think, about 80% of the purchasing power. So I'll stop there, Brad.
Thank you very much. Terrific comments by all. I have lots of questions, but I'll try to restrain myself and turn it over to the floor. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And if you would be so kind as to identify yourself and your organization and ask your question. Okay, well, then I guess that gives me the privilege to abuse my moderator's position and maybe get people warmed up. So John, you were kind to lay out the 5 options. I'm going to press you. What probabilities do you assign to each?
I'm going to throw out some probabilities. I'm not going to associate them with the item, and you'll have to match them. Let's see. I actually think the status quo is, I mean, it's usually, it's probably statistically and experientially prudent to bet on the status quo. And I would bet on the status quo. I think the parties are pretty far apart. So, 2.0 right now seems like a tough putt to me. But I also think, as I said in my opening remarks, I actually don't think there's a high likelihood. I think there's some likelihood, but I don't believe there's a high likelihood of NAFTA being repealed or us withdrawing from it completely without anything in its place.
Thanks. Yes, here in the front.
Hi. Hello. Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. We talked a little bit about the gaps between the U.S. proposals and what what Mexico and Canada could accept. With round 5 coming up next week, what is the expectation of that round and the U.S. position on these proposals? Is there any sense that there's going to be any change, or are the sunset procurement, ISDS, auto rules of origin, all of these things, are those expected to be the quote-unquote end game that we'll have to wait till the far end of the first quarter of 2018 to see any change with?
Who wants to take that? Who's close enough to? David?
Thanks for the question. I think it's hard to say. We're in the middle of a negotiation between the three countries. It's an ongoing process. I guess I would say we're focused more on the facts that we know today, which were the proposals tabled in the 4th and the 3rd rounds, that Christy and I summarized several of those proposals that deeply worry our members. There have also been other proposals that we also summarized in terms of 21st century type issues, digital commerce, cross-border data flows, et cetera, that certainly are very encouraging and appear to be informed by provisions or proposals from TPP and TISA. Today, I think from our Business Roundtable perspective, we are deeply concerned when you add all those proposals up that it paints a picture that would cost growth and jobs and competitiveness more than it would promote it. But that's my speaking today, and again, this is a negotiation and an ongoing process, and we're keen to continue to engage with the administration and Congress and work as hard and as constructively as we can to get the best possible outcomes to support more growth and jobs.
All I would add to Dave's comments is, and I don't think this is much more of a direct response to your question in the sense that I don't think we really know the answer on the administration side, but we certainly hope that among the areas that Dave outlined, whether it be cross-border services, digital trade, telecom, customs, and other areas, we hope that there would be continued progress to try and complete what we see as very positive elements of the agreement, and that consideration of these other proposals, which we see as very concerning, wouldn't get in the way of that progress. But at this point, I think we just really don't know in terms of this round. So we hope there's continued progress, but beyond that, I don't think we know.
I just had a very quick question.
You
Obviously,
could identify yourself in
oh,
your.
sorry. Hera Abbasi, and full disclosure, I'm with CSI. So I just had a quick question. Obviously, the Hill is talking about tax reform. We're still in the markup. All the news is about tax reform. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you see any connection between the growth being achieved in tax reform and sort of what the business community is doing in NAFTA, or do you view those as completely separate entities? And hopefully that was a softball. in case people didn't-
Well, my answer is probably not going to be what you wanted to hear, but yeah, we have to look at all other policies, and they're all interconnected. So, I'll just say on the tax front, like, I mean, there's a proposal, big part of the legislation going through would make all, in many circumstances, profits earned offshores tax-free. How is that going to incentivize more investment in the United States? I can answer that question. It won't. It'll discourage job creation in the United States and more in other countries. So it will lead to more outsourcing. So yeah, we actually have to have consistency with our tax policies and our trade policies and our investment policies too. If we create that much of a hole in the deficit, how are we going to be able to invest in education infrastructure to have the best workforce, to have infrastructure that's not falling apart? How are we going to do that? I think that's a very open question. I'm very concerned that the long-term economic implications for this tax bill are very bad, and it could turn out, if it's on the course it's going, to be a real jobs killer.
Thanks, Hera, for the question. I would, I guess, reiterate the point I made earlier about a three-legged stool, right, in terms of with tax reform, regulatory reforms, and expanding U.S. trade opportunities, are all work hand in hand to grow the economy and support more jobs and investment. And in terms of U.S. trade opportunities, we BRT updated our trade policy principles back in the spring, and even in the trade area, that again, it's not whether you're for trade or against trade, as Josh put it earlier. Our principles reflect that it's expanding free and fair trade, as some put it, and also addressing unfair trade practices and unfair imports as well. So both of those sides of the coin are very important.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting panel. I'm Sherry Stevenson, a senior fellow with the ICTSD. It's a think tank out of Geneva. I guess, if we put this in perspective, when the president came into office last January, he took the U.S. out of the TPP with the justification that in its place, there would be a lot of bilateral agreements negotiated, and that would make up for a big agreement amongst 12 countries, which in theory was unfair for various reasons. We haven't really seen a whole lot of enthusiasm about stepping up to replace TPP with bilateral agreements. And I think this week will be a little bit of a cold reality check after the visit to Asia, where I don't think any of the TPP remaining countries are going to jump up and say, we want to negotiate a bilateral agreement. In fact, that certainly didn't come out of the Japan visit, and I don't see any other country stepping in. It's different with NAFTA because NAFTA was not just a text. NAFTA is an existing trade agreement, a treaty in force, and has been for 23 years. But what is similar in both cases is that the business community was against pulling out, and the business community is against pulling out of NAFTA like it was out of TPP, and yet that was done. So clearly it was a political gesture and not one that took into account the views of those who actually use the trade agreements, that is the business community, the exporters and importers. So my question is, in this case, the stakes are really higher because the agreement exists, not just on paper, although they were very high before for the TPP. My question is, you guys are lawyers on the panel. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a trade economist. Most of you are lawyers. I've heard different opinions. Can the president just unilaterally pull us out of NAFTA?
Well, first of all, with regard to TPP, and I don't say this to defend the administration, that's not my role, and it's not a role that they would probably seek for me to have. But I don't think they promised to replace TPP with a series of bilaterals. There was responses at different points to questions about, well, is there an Act Two, and there was some mention of it. But I don't think anyone should seriously think that this administration views bilateral trade agreements as a major priority. I think the clear focus of this administration is Buy America, Hire American. I think for good or bad, their view is we have the largest market in the world, and if we focus on job creation here, then that will be more effective economic policy than trying to open up foreign markets more than they're already open. With regard to the President's authority to withdraw, NAFTA makes clear that the parties can withdraw. Obviously, NAFTA doesn't speak to the detail of how each country must proceed internally. That's not the place of NAFTA. But the President does have constitutional authority in the trade and treaty area. And treaty, I mean more broadly, trade agreements, even if they aren't treated as a treaty before the Senate, going through advice and consent, supermajority, passage, et cetera, are still treaties, small t, from a constitutional law analysis perspective. The President, the Congress has clear constitutional authority in the trade area as well, more explicit than the President's. But, my sense is from looking at the law and the cases, is the President does have this authority. Whether the Congress asserts its legal or at least political will and authority to, in the face of a withdrawal, I think is an open question. But as a question of constitutional law, I think the stronger argument is the President is authorized to do this.
I would just, I would just add quickly that I think the other, the question in addition to the very good one that John raises, which is on the face of it, certainly 2205 of NAFTA provides the words that any of the parties can provide notice of withdrawal, doesn't speak to the internal process that would need to be followed. But that does not say what the reaction might be if that happened. But the other thing I was going to say is it does also not speak to the various pieces of the agreement and how a withdrawal would be effectuated. So there's the tariff piece, there's the goods piece, there's the services piece. So I would just add that I think that's an open question.
So a services agreement could persist if we withdrew from goods? Is that what
No, I'm just saying that I think there's a lack of clarity in the statute and other statutes, the Trade Act of 74 and 88, as to how an actual withdrawal would be effectuated with respect to various pieces of the agreement. So I wouldn't prejudge and say, yes, you could keep a piece in place, but I think it's just not clear how legally you would follow up on withdrawal with respect to services as opposed to tariffs or goods.
I just wanted to comment on a couple things of your question, which I welcome. One is just that I just want to make it clear that the issues that I'm talking about around increasing wages in Mexican workers, that wouldn't be fixed by getting out of NAFTA. That's not going to somehow change the laws in Mexico. It's not going to somehow lead to changes in the trade balance, magically. Like that won't happen. And just on the TPP, I take a little quarrel with kind of the way you framed it, because there were an awful lot of citizens, a lot of voters, a lot of people in the United States, a lot of UAW members who had deep problems with the structure of the TPP, the weakness of the labor chapter, the failure to have any measures to deal with currency manipulation. I could go on and on. But just, I think, there was very much legitimate and sincere and serious concerns about the agreement from ordinary people.
Tim Bennett, Transatlantic Business Council. Have any of the panelists seen any indication that any Canadian negotiating position is affected by the recently implemented CETA, the Canada-EU trade agreement, or the Mexican negotiating positions impacted by the ongoing renegotiation of the Mexico-EU FTA?
Tim, good to be with you. Thoughtful question. I could turn that question around on you, too, being with the Transatlantic Business Council. I don't have any specific examples, Tim. I guess in the interest of time, too. I mean, I suspect, but don't know, that just like in some of the issues we talked about today, where U.S. Proposals are being informed by past U.S. trade agreements, including CORUS and TPP and TISA. I would suspect, but don't know, that the Canadian and Mexican positions or proposals in NAFTA are being informed by other negotiations they've undertaken as well. But I don't have any more specificity.
The only thing I would add, and I have not seen negotiating text, so I don't know, but is my understanding is that certainly in the investment area, that CETA may have influenced the Canadian the position they're taking in NAFTA.
Hi, Bill Frymore, Stewart & Stewart. One comment and then a question. Appreciate Dave's points on the labor provisions, and because back when the NAFTA was negotiated originally, of course, all the business community was opposed to the inclusion of labor provisions. So that progress and consistency throughout the business community should be noted. I wanted to ask Josh, though, about Canada and the progressive internationalism of the Prime Minister and the importance of the union movement in Canada. The percentage loss of plants and jobs in Canada, I think, is worse than in the United States. So I wondered about the common approach that you're taking with the Canadian unions and the impact on Trudeau's progressive international position, and if some of the other labor, indigenous people proposals that he's talked about have a chance in this negotiation.
So the handicapping of that is something that I'm not going to do because, I could be way off, and I've been wrong many times on predicting those kind of things. But I will say this. I'm not sure, are you talking on a ratio basis with Canada as far as plants? I know it's significant loss there as well, many of the same issues. We embrace the idea of that our standards should be raised up when they're falling behind, and they are. And our labor laws need to be strengthened big time. So we have solidarity with Canadian unions and with independent Mexican unions, and we think that we really all have a shared interest here. And so I think here's the fundamental thing with Mexico. It's this old principle that Henry Ford laid out about being able to buy the products you make. Mexican workers are nowhere near being able to buy the cars that they make. We're not against there being a Mexican auto industry, far from it. But what we need is that you need to have a domestic market there that can actually, support a good share of the production, which is certainly not the case now. So it's this matter of this kind of direct displacement of jobs and the fact that, we really have an imbalance because of the low wages in Mexico.
Thank you. Jean-François Boitin with CEPI, French economic think tank in Paris. I have 3 questions to Josh. First question is, do you think that the U.S. is in the best position to lecture other negotiators on labor laws? Because after all, we have seen a tremendous rise in the auto industry in the southeastern states because of the lack of unions, because of subsidies that probably would be banned under WTO rules. Second question is, shouldn't you look at the German model, where your colleagues at IG Metall are paid way more than you are, and the automobile industry is extremely competitive because of outsourcing towards Central European countries? And the third question is, if NAFTA disappears, the duty rate, if I'm correct, is 2.5% on auto parts and automobiles. Will that help your case or not?
Well, it's not a matter of, thank you for your question. It's not a matter of lecturing. It's a matter of, through trade agreements, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve higher wages, better working conditions, or is it investor-driven and capital-driven and workers are left out? That's really the thing. So as far as should we be reflective and look internally at our own laws and our own standards? Absolutely, absolutely. You know, as far as looking at other models that other countries are using, you know, we're in solidarity with workers from IG Metall and elsewhere. And what's really needed is we need companies that collectively bargain all around the country to not view the United States as an exception. That's what we're seeing from many of the foreign auto companies. They're organized everywhere else except the United States. So it's not that they have a problem working with unions. They are deliberately going for a low-wage strategy here. And by the way, hiring an awful lot of temp workers instead of full-time. Sorry, I get a little heated on that topic. The third, though, is that it's not so clear-cut with the 2.5 because you also have a 25% truck tariff. But I think the whole thing about you know, what happens if withdrawing, how does that impact trade imbalance? You know, the question is like, you know, how is that going to drive investment decisions in a different way? It's not clear at all that it will. Again, our main advocacy is for improving NAFTA. We are not, that is where we're looking at, and that's what the administration is trying, you know, as a negotiation going on. So we're trying to work within those parameters to make it a better agreement. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. We've been doing a little look at the Trump administration to see if there's any precedents. And the one thing we did notice was the Iranian agreement, which he withdrew from, but nothing happened because he never asked Congress to do anything. And, excuse me. Oh, is it better than that? Hello? Okay. Anyway, we were looking at the Iranian example where he lived up to his campaign pledge, I'm going to pull out of the agreement, the Iranian agreement, but he didn't do anything, but he had Congress. And I would ask Sherry Stevenson's question a little bit differently and saying, can the president withdraw but do nothing? Does he have to raise duties if Mexico, for example, doesn't raise duties? Can he change some of the non-tariff measures if he doesn't ask Congress for authority to change the law? Because that would solve his problem, i.e. his commitment, but yet not do anything to discourage trade. Is that a legal possibility since you're a bunch of lawyers and I'm only a trade negotiator? So I asked that question. Thank you.
As Christy noted, you know, the consequences of withdrawing are less clear than, at least in my mind, whether the president has constitutional authority to withdraw. There's important subsidiary follow-on questions that flow from it. But the Iran precedent, if you will, you know, could be an interesting one where it, you know, the president could take an action, but ultimately the ball is put into Congress's court. to do something or not do something. And you know, it's worth exploring.
I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and when NAFTA was, you know, like 20 years ago, I used to be with IBC, International Business Government Counselor, and I don't know if you know Jim Clausen, God bless his soul. He was very pro-NAFTA, and he told me that the major benefit of NAFTA is that it's going to increase wages in Mexico and decrease unemployment rate. And given that President Trump has this major goal to reduce illegal immigration from Mexico part, do you think that what Jim Clausen used to believe has transpired in Mexico? Have it increased the wages and decreased the unemployment rate? And if that is true, do you think it's help to have illegal immigration in the United States from Mexico? Thanks.
If I indulge my fellow panelists, I'll give a short answer. My short answer to that is, I think by any metric, other than violence in certain parts of Mexico, economic indicators are all pointing significantly higher today than they were 22 years ago. It's a more stable democracy. It's a more stable economy. Wages are up. Consumer consumption is up. Illegal immigration is down because there are more promising opportunities in Mexico. So in my humble opinion, the record is quite clear that NAFTA has been good for Mexico, and it's hard for me to imagine that Mexico, even regardless of how one views the current situation there, or here for that matter, it's hard for me to see that Mexico today would be better off if NAFTA hadn't been agreed to and put in place. And I feel the same about the U.S. I mean, I think trade agreements tend to be oversold in both directions. People pretend that they're these magical elixirs that will change everything, and that's rarely the case. But rarely are they responsible for this parade of horribles either. The fact of the matter is, the economic fortunes of any country is a function of the policies that they put in place within their borders. The policies they put in place at the borders it can optimize or not, but the policies inside the border are going to be determinative.
You know, I think just a couple things, you know, focusing on the auto area and manufacturing. Labor costs in Mexico's auto industry are the lowest among 20 auto-producing countries, and wages have dropped for auto workers by 25% between 2007 and 2014, equivalent about $2.93 an hour now. So are Mexican manufacturing workers, auto workers thriving? No, and a major reason why is because, again, they do not have the right to collectively bargain and actually come together and negotiate fair contracts. That has not been happening.
Hi, I'm Rachel Minogue with Third Way. Mr. Nasser, you mentioned that the labor chapters in NAFTA need a complete relook. Could you go into more detail as to specific provisions the UAW would support and where there's room to compromise with Mexico?
Sure. So, I mean, as been stated earlier, there's no binding labor chapter at all in NAFTA. So, by definition, any chapter is better than no chapter. But if you're talking about the kind of changes that would be needed, I think, you know, having the ability for private parties, unions, workers, and such to be able to challenge, you know, make challenges to cases, having really clear and expedited financial penalties, economic ramifications for companies that do violate workers' rights, I think is a really important part. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of ideas. I'm not going to go through them all. They're all well documented. I could point you to them. But I think the idea is that the current free trade agreement trade model, the proof is in the pudding. What cases have actually gone all the way to actually help workers? I can answer that question. It's zero in our existing FTAs. So that's not working. So we need to have a total relook. And tweaking the labor chapter is not going to fix it.
Lem Bracken, Bloomberg B&A. John, you mentioned that Congress would assert itself. Could you give us some ideas as to what they could possibly do during and after the negotiations?
No. We're in new terrain here, so I think I think it's time for creativity for Congress to consider ways that it could assert its legal and political will. I mean, if you look at, put aside where the constitutional authorities lie, and let's stipulate that both the executive branch and the legislative branch have constitutional authorities in these areas. We're in a new terrain here where, the prospects of a president deciding to withdraw the United States from a major trade agreement is unprecedented. Presidents make very important decisions exercising their constitutional authorities all the time, and Congress doesn't always get a vote. But especially in the area of foreign affairs. But NAFTA came into being after a very lengthy, considerable national debate, congressional debate, and implementing legislation. Perhaps the will of the Congress may be, in the face of a withdrawal, if such a decision were taken, to just let that happen. But that doesn't comport with my experience, at least, with how Congress views its institutional prerogatives with regard to trade policy. So for that reason, even though I am not going to spell out today the mechanisms that could be employed, I find it out of step with how Congress as an institution has behaved with regard to trade policy for it to just sit on its hands in the face of a decision to withdraw from a major trade agreement.
So we're approaching time, so please join me in thanking just a terrific panel discussion. Look for our next event. See you later. Thank you.